and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread will live forever. He said all this while they had retreated and was now teaching in the synagogue in the city of Capernaum. You ever heard that? Great googly moogly. What is that? Unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you do not have life within you. Opponents of Christianity in the first centuries after this rejected Christianity as cannibalism based on these kinds of teaching. Rejected it flat out. Because it was barbaric. These words were used against the Christians. And it was a sense of you can't get that kind of into barbarism and that kind of cannibalism, and there's no way to do it. If you come from a Catholic background, then you've heard of the phrase transubstantiation. Yes? No? Yes? Yes? No? Really? Transubstantiation.
Can you spell that?
Couple maybe, some go on Trans-Siberian what? What are you talking about? Transubstantiation. Transubstantiation states that the priest has the power whenever the emblems or the sacraments are served, that the bread and the juice or the wine literally become the body and the blood of Christ. Transubstantiation. The problem with that is A, priests aren't mystical. B, there's no biblical reference to that. C, for that to happen, then you have to have a multiple sacrifice millions of times, because it has to be his body and blood shed again. Jesus died once. There'll never be another. So what is this talking about? Well, some have looked at this and said, what Jesus is talking about here, obviously, is talking about what you and I call the Lord's Supper. Not literally transubstantiation, but a reference to how whenever we do what you guys just did, whenever we take that little unleavened bread wafer, whenever we take that little cup of juice, that this is a remembrance of and represents the body and the blood of Christ, and that Jesus is saying, whenever you take me in, whenever you take the emblem, whenever you take the sacrament, whenever you take the bread, whenever you take the juice, then this is putting me into your body, and this is like the same as eating my flesh and drinking of my blood. And that very well may be, but I think there's more to it. Some have said and argued and talked about how what Jesus is saying here is, of course, not literally cannibalism, this is my body, and you have to eat my flesh, you have to drink my blood. But what he is saying is that whenever you identify yourself as a servant of Christ, or when you call yourself a Christian, that this is the way of Christ. What he was trying to teach them was to recognize, you know what? You have to take in what my teachings are. You have to accept it. It's like taking in my own flesh and in my own blood whenever you accept who I am. And you have to take me in as all of me, and it has to become part of very much who you are. In other words, this was his symbolic way of saying, you have to take me and my teaching and my value system and my doctrine, and you have to take that into yourself as if you're eating my flesh and drinking my blood. And it could be. But I think there's more to that. You see, he was talking to Jews. Now, way back before, and you may have noticed, if you haven't, I'll tell you anyway. On several occasions in the last few months, as I have preached different sermons about stuff, I have taken extra time and added a few minutes onto each sermon and tried to identify and retell the story and re-explain the story of what happened in different parts whenever the Israelites were in Egypt and they were being brought out to go to the Promised Land. Just a few weeks ago, we talked about Abraham and those first covenants and that whole thing, and we took some extra time and I kind of laid out a timeline for you. Well, even if you don't know that story at all, you all have seen Charlton Heston, the movie, Moses, Ten Commandments, the whole thing, yes, no, yes, no, sure. Okay, so coming from that, and if you have a biblical point, that's even better, but coming from that, you have the understanding that there were the plagues that were inflicted upon the nation of Egypt, and the idea was that the final plague came from the the death angel, the firstborn of every household, was to drop dead. From then on, the Jewish people, the entire nation, every year, remembered what was known as the Passover. Whenever they had the Passover feast, whenever they had the Passover celebration, it was a week-long celebration, and the week-long itself was called the Passover, but there was one specific meal that was called the Passover meal as well. And it all ties into the crucifixion of Jesus, because whenever Jesus Christ goes on the cross, whenever Jesus is betrayed, whenever Jesus is arrested, whenever Jesus is put on trial, whenever he goes to the cross, all of that happens at the end of the week of the Passover meal, or the Passover feast, and it all happens the night whenever they are celebrating the Passover meal itself. In the meal itself, they eat lamb. Take it into their body. Why? Because the night the death angel came, if you were to imagine this speaker stand here as a door, each household was to sacrifice a lamb, take a certain branch, dip it in the blood, and put it on the doorposts of their house. Thus, they were saved by the blood of a lamb. Every year after that, they would eat lamb to remember that sacrifice. Whenever Jesus tells them, you have to digest me, it is not so far off what they have been doing for centuries in digesting the meal to remember what happened at Passover. And on this occasion, Jesus says, here it is, you have to digest me, just as you have done for that, for what I'm about to do. Now, you can go to 20 other churches and hear 20 other representations of that. You guys go home, read this for yourself. We can disagree, both go to heaven, you'll be wrong, but that's okay. I'm just kidding. It's something to get you to start thinking about it. But there's so much more to this. Do you realize that as they're talking about this, the whole point of everything is about eating? As I've been a minister, and I've talked about this in sermons before, but as I've been a minister for 50 years now, I've heard for I don't know how many times people that either come to the church that I'm the minister of or leave the church that I'm the minister of and say the very biblical phrase, well, I'm just not being fed where I'm at. You ever heard that? Maybe even said that? Yeah. Now, let's state the obvious first. You have a spiritual responsibility to grow. And you have a spiritual responsibility to be involved in a Christian community that will enhance and support and enable that growth to take place. And there are churches out there that are a waste of your time. We all know that. There are people out there calling themselves ministers that are a waste of your time. And we know that. Hopefully I'm not one of them, but you never can be too sure. So we recognize that truth about any profession, that there are some really good people in that profession and there are some real idiots in any profession. That's true about churches as well. And if you come across a church that you realize, I can't grow here, literally can't grow, I need to go somewhere where I can grow, that is an absolute fact, and that is there. But that aside, as I have preached before, I will say again today, and it is so important to understand, the church is not responsible for your spiritual growth. You are responsible for your spiritual growth. I am responsible for my own personal spiritual growth in Christ. Folks, if I'm not being fed, I need to bend my elbow.